Hello, everyone. This is the first lecture in our lecture series for this semester, and our topic is the endocrine system, which is chapter 16 in your textbook. So at the beginning of every chapter, you'll have a list of learning objectives. Learning objectives are a great place to go back to once you have studied the information and see if you can answer these, because this is giving you the information that you should have gotten out of the chapter. So if you like to make a review sheet or a study guide for yourself, because I do not make them, then a great place to start is to go back and answer these learning objectives. These can also be found in your textbook. All right, let's start with a quick overview of the endocrine system. So our endocrine system is going to regulate the activity of our body cells. This is going to allow our body cells to maintain homeostasis. And in the case of the endocrine system, we're going to be using a chemical called a hormone. Hormones travel through the blood to the target. Last semester, you learned about the nervous system. And the nervous system was also a communication system within the body. And you were using neurotransmitters to send messages. In the endocrine system, we're going to be using a hormone to send messages, and there's some significant differences. With the exception of the adrenaline hormones, the endocrine system is pretty slow. It requires more time to process a response at the target when we compare it to the nervous system. It is also less specific. The same hormone may affect different physiological processes, and we'll see that with thyroid hormone, for example. The endocrine system is unique in that most of the organs that are in the endocrine system are also in other systems. So the classic example is the pancreas. The pancreas is part of the endocrine system with the release of insulin and glucagon. However, it's also part of the digestive system. So taking a look and comparing and contrasting endocrine versus nervous system. All right. The signaling mechanisms in our endocrine system are chemical. This is our hormones that we're talking about. In our nervous system, we had chemicals, neurotransmitters, as well as electrical signals. All right. The primary chemical signal, of course, is hormones in the endocrine system, and it was neurotransmitters in our nervous system. The distance traveled, the endocrine system, how far those hormones travel, it could be a long way, it could be a short way. In the nervous system, they were always short. Remember, neurotransmitters only had their effect at the synapse, the space between the two cells. They didn't have any effect anywhere else. The response time in the endocrine system, typically it's long, but it can be short as well. In the nervous system, the response time is always fast. And the response to changes occur in the internal environment for the endocrine system and the external and endocrine in the nervous system. So what are some of the things that the endocrine system does? What is it signaling? What is it communicating about? Reproduction, growth and development, maintenance of our water balances, fluid balances, what they basically say, electrolyte, water, and nutrient balances of our blood. The regulation of cellular metabolism, how fast we burn calories, and our energy balance, how much we store, how much we burn, and then mobilization of body defenses through our immune system. So endocrine glands. So all the way back in Bio 210, you should have learned about the two big categories of glands. There's exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Endocrine glands are what we're talking about in this chapter. They are going to secrete the hormones. The hormones are released into the interstitial fluid around the cells and then diffuse into the bloodstream and delivered to the target. So you can see that with the picture over on the right. Some examples, but not inclusive, but some examples of endocrine glands include your pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the thymus, the adrenal glands, the gonads, the pancreas, so on and so on. So as a review, exocrine glands from last semester release their contents through a duct. and that duct led out to the epithelial surface. So this was things like mucus and sweat and saliva and breast milk. Those are all examples that are being secreted from an exocrine gland. And we will discuss those in other chapters, like the digestive chapter and reproductive and all of those kinds of things. We're going to discuss exocrine glands again from last semester. So a little bit of terminology, the different types of chemical signals that we have. Hormones. I've used that word a bunch, but let's clarify it. These are secreted into the extracellular fluid and diffuse into the blood or the lymph, and they travel throughout the body, so they are a chemical. We also use the term autocrine sometimes in this chapter, and that is a chemical that causes a response in the same cell that secretes it. So auto means same. And then paracrines, these are chemicals that create or cause a response in cells locally, right? Somewhere right around it. Para means next to. Technically, neither of these are hormones, but we talk about them and define them in this chapter because there's not really any other place to do that. So we put them in this chapter. So just know that those are not hormones, but they're also important chemicals and have important effects as well. So the glands of the endocrine system are going to release hormones only. The other types of chemical signals that I just mentioned, the autocrines and the paracrines, they are produced by cells that belong to other systems, and they will come up periodically. What does a hormone look like? What's the chemical structure of it? So hormones can be divided into two major groups based on their chemical structure. We have the amino acid based hormones. So you remember amino acids? Those amino acids are like individual beads of a Mardi Gras necklace, and we put a whole bunch of them together and we make peptides and proteins. A peptide is a string of 50 or less amino acids, whereas a protein is 50 or more. So a hormone could be an individual amino acid or just a couple of amino acids, what we call amines. It could be a peptide, which is less than 50 amino acids, or it could be a protein, which is more than 50 amino acids all strung together, linked by peptide bonds. The other main category are the steroids. So these are all derived from cholesterol that you make in your body. Some actions of hormones. So target cells must have a specific receptor for that hormone if that hormone is going to cause a response. So hormones are floating around in your blood. And why do they not activate every single cell out there? Because very simple, the cell doesn't have the receptor for it. So if the cell does not have the receptor, that hormone just floats on by. It's kind of like going someplace to a restaurant and needing a parking spot. You're not going to go into that restaurant unless you get a parking spot to put your vehicle in, right? Well, the same thing is true with a hormone. It's not going to have any effect on that particular cell unless it can park on that cell in a receptor. When they are able to do this, when they're able to park, then they alter the target cell activity by stimulating protein synthesis, which is transcription translation. So if you don't remember that lovely jewel, you might want to run back to chapter 3 in Bio 210 and remind yourself what transcription translation that leads to protein synthesis is all about. Another thing that hormones can do is activate or deactivate enzymes. So if you'll remember from the previous semester, enzymes are proteins that speed up the rate of a reaction. They may alter in the cause an alteration in the permeability of the cell membrane. So a little bit more from what we learned last semester. Remember, cells have all those channels. The cell membrane has those different channels, and that's how things get in and out of the cell. Hormones change how easily or not so easily things get in and out of the cell, what we call the permeability. Hormones can also alter the rate of mitosis, so they can speed it up or slow it down, and they can speed up or slow down the rate of the actual growth of the cell after it has gone through mitosis. And then finally, another thing that hormones can do is stimulate the secretion of a particular product or chemical. And we'll see that with releasing hormones that stimulate other organs to release their hormones, and so on and so on. How is hormone secretion regulated? So we don't want huge amounts of um, hormone to be floating around, because that actually can be just as detrimental as not having enough. We want just the right amount, what we call homeostasis. So we tightly control the amount of hormone that is released. The body maintains this control by balancing hormone production and degradation. So how much we make and how much we break down. That regulation of hormone secretion is going to happen in two ways. One is through feedback loops. You guys learned about feedback loops in the very beginning of last semester. I hate to keep referring back to last semester, but there was an awful lot of important stuff that you learned then that you're finally going to get to apply. So feedback loops, remember positive and negative feedback loops. Remember that negative feedback loops are always trying to maintain balance. They're always trying to bring things back into balance, whereas positive feedback loops work just the opposite. They are intentionally causing things to go out of homeostasis. And then the other regulation of hormone secretion is through endocrine gland stimuli. All right, so just a reminder again on those feedback loops. So again, if you do not remember this from last semester, it is imperative that you go spend some time reminding yourself about negative and positive feedback loops. All right, negative feedback inhibits further secretion of a hormone when you have the right amount. Remember, use the example, if you had me in 210, I use the example of a thermostat. I think a lot of people use that example, but it's like the thermostat in your house. You have it set at a particular temperature, and if it gets too hot or too cold, either the air conditioning or the heater clicks on and brings it back to that level. And that's how negative feedback works. It always brings things back to where it is supposed to be, what they call the set point. Positive feedback means that additional hormone is being released in response to the stimuli. And there's really only a few examples of positive feedback loops when we talk about hormones. One of them happens to be childbirth, and the other one happens to be stopping blood flow hemostasis. When we talk about another way that the amount of hormone that you have is controlled, another way it's controlled, if it's not through positive feedback or negative feedback, is through endocrine gland stimuli. So hormone production is stimulated by chemical and neural signals. There is humoral stimuli, neural stimuli, and hormonal stimuli, and I'm going to talk about each of these. So in hormonal stimuli, the changes in the blood levels of non-hormonal chemicals are going to cause the release or inhibition of a hormone to maintain homeostasis. Remember, our goal is always to maintain homeostasis when we're talking about the concentration or the level of hormone we have in the blood. We always want it to be within that homeostatic range. So a good example of this is the regulation of blood glucose. High blood glucose levels, so let's just say you ate a bag of M&Ms and now you've got a high blood glucose level, that causes the release of insulin from your pancreas. Insulin's going to go out into the blood, and it's going to pick up all of that excess glucose, and it's going to shunt it over to the liver, where the liver is going to store it as glycogen. So in that particular case, you had a non-hormonal substance, i.e. sugar, that was triggering the release of a hormone. What about neural stimuli? Hormones can also be released in response to neural stimuli, and this is where we see fight or flight. So you learned a little bit about this last semester when you learned about your autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic and parasympathetic sides. Remember, the parasympathetic was the slow things down side, and the sympathetic side was the speed things up side, what we call fight or flight. So sympathetic neurons are going to signal the adrenal glands, because that's where these hormones are stored, to secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine, and that's going to improve the body's ability to fight or to flee. The final way that we can influence the amount of hormone that we have in the blood is through hormones. So other hormones can influence the hormone levels. So an endocrine gland may secrete a hormone in response to the presence of another hormone that's produced by a different endocrine gland. So the classic example here is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus in your brain is going to control the release of pituitary hormones using releasing hormones. So let's take a picture of our over on the right hand side. If you remember, or take a look at the picture on the right hand side, up at the top, in the very top of that picture, is where the hypothalamus is. Remember where that was in your studies of the brain. And then coming down off of the bottom of the brain, or the ventral side of the brain, you had a structure called the pituitary gland, and it was connected to the brain by the infundibulum. That pituitary gland was sitting in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, sitting in a very protected, sheltered place in the skull. All right. Hormones called releasing hormones are going to be sent down that infundibulum from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. And the anterior pituitary gland is now going to release a different hormone, and that's going to travel through the blood to the target, which could be, for example, the thyroid gland or the adrenal gland or the ovary or the testes or wherever it's going to go. It's going to have a specific target. Okay. So there's an incidence of one gland releasing a hormone that affects another gland that causes the release of a different hormone that's going to go down to a different organ. All right, so it's kind of a whole chain reaction that's going to happen there. So I had mentioned that exocrine glands have a duct that take their product that they make, breast or sweat or whatever it is, breast milk or sweat or whatever it is, out to the surface, right? Endocrine glands are called ductless, not like quack quack duck, but duct, like a tube, right? That's going to empty their hormonal products directly into the blood. The major endocrine glands in this system are going to be the pituitary gland. So we're going to talk about the difference between the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the gonads, the pineal gland, and the thymus. So that's what we're going to be focusing on for the remainder of this lecture, along with some other organs and tissues that have minor endocrine function. So we'll start all the way at the top. We're going to start with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So this is considered the command center of the endocrine system. So this complex, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, are going to secrete several hormones that directly produce responses at target issues, but they're also going to secrete hormones that are going to regulate the synthesis and secretion of other hormones at other glands. So what I was talking about earlier with the hypothalamus releasing hormones to the pituitary and the pituitary releasing hormones that are going to target other organs. The command center is going to coordinate the messages of the endocrine system and the nervous system. So this is kind of where all of that is coordinated each time. And the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus, as I mentioned earlier, through a strip of tissue called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland is well protected in a bony structure called the sella turcica. They used to refer to the pituitary gland as the master gland, and you sometimes will see that still. Mostly that's been filtered out because they now understand that the pituitary gland is really just a storage facility for hormones. The real control is coming through the endocrine system, through the hypothalamus. So here's what it looks like, just as a reminder of a little bit of anatomy of the nervous system. So the hypothalamus is the blue, looking at the picture in the box, the big picture in the very middle of the screen. The hypothalamus is the blue area. All right, and then right below that is that orange area that's considered the infundibulum. It's really like a thread of tissue, really, really skinny, really fragile looking if you've ever dissected a brain or watched a dissection of a brain. And then the pituitary gland is actually two glands that are squished together, the anterior and the posterior. They are separate glands. They have separate origins where they came from, and so they are separately, but you see that they're sitting in that little pocket, and that little pocket is what's called the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So a little more detail about that pituitary gland. Again, two lobes, posterior and anterior. The posterior is also called the neurohypophysis. Neurohypophysis. The old name for the pituitary gland was the hypophysis. So the neurohypophysis is the name of the alternative name of the posterior pituitary. You don't see that very often anymore, but it is still out there. And it is derived from neural tissue, hence the name neural, right? The anterior pituitary is the larger of the two sides. It actually has an alternative name as well called the adenohypophysis, and it is derived from glandular, oral glandular tissue. So during development, these two areas are kind of like outpocketings that of the oral area and of the brain, and they kind of squeeze together and form this organ that we collectively call the pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary is an extension of the neurons of the hypothalamus, and it is derived from neural tissue during embryonic development, what I just mentioned. The cell bodies are going to rest up in the hypothalamus, but their axons, the tail, is going to pass through that infundibulum and end in the axon terminals that comprise the posterior pituitary. Ignore that typo. I need to fix that for infundibulum. So the posterior pituitary gland itself does not produce any hormones. It stores and secretes hormones that are produced up in the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary is going to secrete two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So let's talk about what the two hormones of the posterior pituitary do. Oxytocin is the one most people know about, right? It stimulates uterine contraction and dilation of the cervix during the process of childbirth. This hormone is released through a positive feedback mechanism. So this is one of the two that we talk about that that is responsible for doing its job through positive feedback. It also is responsible for milk ejection that reflects in breastfeeding moms. So if you've breastfed or you've known someone who's breastfed, the sound of a baby crying causes what's called letdown, and milk just starts running even if the baby's not there. Sometimes even if it's not your baby, right? That is caused by the hormone oxytocin. So let's look at how this works in labor and delivery. All right, we're going to start over on the left-hand side where it says head of baby pushes against the cervix. All right. So the head of the baby is pushing against that cervix. That's going to cause nerve impulses in the cervix to be transmitted back up to the brain. The brain is going to stimulate the pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland, to secrete oxytocin. The oxytocin is going to be carried by the blood down to the uterus, and then the oxytocin is going to cause the contraction of the uterus and push the baby towards the cervix. And then as the baby moves towards the cervix and pushes harder, it's going to cause even more oxytocin to ultimately be released. So every contraction is going to cause a greater amount of oxytocin, which is going to lead to a greater contraction until the baby is born. The other posterior pituitary hormone is antidiuretic hormone. Its abbreviation is ADH. So let me say this real quick. Most of these hormones have an abbreviation, a legal abbreviation. You can't just make up your own, right? A legal abbreviation. And that's fine. And you need to know what that abbreviation is, but you also need to know what that abbreviation means. So in this course, I don't allow abbreviations because I need to know that you know what that means. So if you have to write it 2 times in a row, the second time around, you could write ADH. But if you were writing a paragraph, for example, the first time you were talking about antidiuretic hormone, you would have to write out antidiuretic hormone. If you repeated that somewhere else in that little paragraph you were writing, then you could abbreviate ADH. But I have to know that you know what ADH means or what any of these abbreviations mean. So you're responsible for knowing what it means, but knowing the actual abbreviation, the legal abbreviation. The previous one we looked at, oxytocin, it has been up in the air forever. Some books have it as OT, some have it as OX. I've seen it both ways. So that one is kind of, most of the time people just write out oxytocin because it's some speculation about that one. All right, so antidiuretic hormone. Sorry about that aside there. Um, blood osmolarity, in other words, the saltiness or the concentration of the solutes, is constantly being monitored from that hypothalamus. So you may remember from 210 that the hypothalamus is part of the brain, the small part of the brain that is not included and covered and protected by the blood-brain barrier. Remember, the blood-brain barrier was made by the astrocytes. The astrocytes were keeping things from getting into the actual blood itself, but there were areas where the blood-brain barrier was incomplete, and this is one of them because it has to be able to monitor something specific about the blood all the time. And what it's monitoring is the sodium ions. It wants to know how salty is your blood. So in response to high blood osmolarity, the hypothalamus is going to signal that posterior pituitary to release the hormone antidiuretic hormone, ADH. ADH is going to target specific cells in the kidney tubules, all the way down to the kidneys, and increase the permeability of water, causing increased water reabsorption. In other words, keeping of water. In other words, producing less urine and producing more concentrated urine. So think about what the word means. Antidiuretic. A diuretic makes you urinate. Anti makes you not. All right. So this hormone is being released and keeping you from losing too much water through urine. Okay, a little bit more about ADH. Its release is controlled by negative feedback. So we want to keep a nice homeostatic range of ADH, not too much, not too little. At high concentrations, it causes blood vessels to constrict. When blood vessels constrict, it causes an increase in blood pressure. We'll be talking about blood pressure more in an upcoming chapter. Alcohol inhibits the release of ADH. That causes you to have an increased urine production, which leads to dehydration. So that feeling of a hangover is the result of dehydration of your brain. Diabetes insipidus, DI. So there are several different forms of diabetes. The one most people are familiar with is diabetes mellitus, right? We're going to talk about diabetes mellitus later in the course, but we're going to talk about diabetes insipidus now. This is a rare metabolic disease characterized by sustained underproduction of ADH that causes chronic dehydration. So you're not making enough ADH, so you're urinating more and it's causing you to dehydrate constantly. The symptoms include polydipsia, which is increased thirst, that leads to polyuria, which is increased urine production, that leads to dehydration. That's similar to diabetes mellitus. So a lot of times one of the first signs people get with diabetes mellitus is that they're really, really thirsty all of the time. And they're drinking a lot of water and they're producing a lot of urine. And so you check their blood sugar and their blood sugar is sky high, right? In the case of diabetes insipidus, their blood sugar levels would be normal, completely normal, because that's not what's driving the thirst. It's a different hormone. So diabetes insipidus can be caused by a number of different things. Definitely something you want to look at after someone's had a head injury. So if they've had a head injury and they're suddenly really, really thirsty. And when I say really thirsty, I mean drinking quarts of water, not just, oh, I need an extra glass of water. We all get that sometimes, right? Drinking a lot of extra water. Brain surgery, particularly when they're working in that pituitary area. So pituitary tumors are not an uncommon thing that happens. They are typically benign, and they are removed. And when they're removed, they kind of mess around with that pituitary gland a little bit, and that can cause temporary diabetes insipidus, a brain tumor in that particular area, chronic kidney disease, pregnancy, or genetics. So any of those things could cause diabetes insipidus. So whenever you're learning about these different diseases, I used to teach pathophysiology, which is a fascinating class because you get to learn about all these cool diseases. And the one thing that I used to always stress was make sure you look for things that are unique about that disease. If you just say diabetes insipidus, and just some general terms about it, it sounds like a lot of other things. But the unique thing about this one is that the blood sugar level is normal, but they are experiencing all the symptoms of diabetes mellitus. And then you want to look at all of the other things that could be causing that. So those are our posterior pituitary hormones. Now we need to talk about the 6 hormones that are associated with the anterior pituitary. So here's a little study tip for you. Know for sure that oxytocin and ADH are posterior pituitary. That's easy, right? Now, when we talk about the anterior pituitary hormones, you want to know which 6 are anterior. If you know all of the hormones of the pituitary gland, you know for certain that the posterior pituitary is releasing oxytocin and ADH. The other 6 that we're talking about, they must be anterior pituitary hormones. Okay? So we have 2 classes of hypothalamic hormones that we talk about first, because that's what's regulating the release of these anterior pituitary hormones. Releasing hormones are always going to have RH at the end of the abbreviation, and they stimulate the secretion of anterior pituitary hormones. They're the ones that are traveling down that infundibulum. Then you also have inhibiting hormones coming from the hypothalamus. They always have IH at the end of their name, and they're going to inhibit the release of those hormones from the anterior pituitary. So RH hormones and IH hormones all come from the hypothalamus, all target the anterior pituitary. All right, every single one of them. Hypothalamic releasing hormones travel to the anterior pituitary through the infundibulum, and specifically there is a system called the hypophyseal portal vein system. All right. So what a portal vein system is a circulatory system with 2 capillary beds. So we're going to learn about vessels in an upcoming chapter, and you probably already know that it's artery, arteriole, capillary, venule, vein. That's kind of the route that they travel, right? When we have a portal system, we have artery, arteriole, capillary, small little chunk of vessel, another capillary bed, venule, vein. So there's 2 capillary beds in the middle here. And that's what they're showing you in this picture right here. So that's how the hypothalamic releasing hormones get to the anterior pituitary. All right, let's talk about those hormones. We're going to talk about growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. So TH, ACTH, FH, and LH are tropic hormones. Trope means turning, because they turn on and turn off the function of other endocrine glands. So look at the example of thyroid stimulating hormone. This is considered a tropic hormone. It turns on the function of the thyroid gland. So let's start talking about these. Growth hormone, or GH, is a major hormone in the body that regulates growth, protein synthesis, and cellular reproduction. All fancy words for just saying it regulates growth. It makes you grow. Its primary function is anabolic, meaning that it increases the size of things. It promotes protein synthesis and tissue building through direct and indirect mechanisms. The direct mechanism is known as the glucose-sparing effect. The indirect mechanism is things like producing insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. What is the glucose-sparing effect? So growth hormone stimulates lipolysis, which is the breakdown of adipose tissue, causing the release of the fatty acids into the blood. As a result, many of the tissues switch from using glucose to using fatty acids as their main energy source, which allows the glucose to be saved and spared for other uses. So the reason you would want to do this is because of your brain. I used to always say your brain is a glucose hog. The only fuel your brain can use is glucose. Your other body cells, they can use glucose, they can use fatty acids, they can even, through the process that we'll learn later in the semester, use proteins that have been broken down. But your brain tissue, nope, it's picky. All it wants is glucose. So we always have to have a certain amount of it spared and set aside for brain function. And so that's what one of the things that growth hormone does is it makes sure that there's always enough glucose set aside through the breakdown of fatty acids that can be used as an alternative fuel source. Growth hormone stimulates the liver to break down glycogen into glucose, which is then deposited into the blood, and that's going to lead to an increase in the glucose levels, right? Glucose is in the blood, it stimulates cell proliferation and enhances protein synthesis. All right, growth hormone also directly accelerates the rate of protein synthesis in skeletal muscle and bones. In other words, it makes you grow. It does this through insulin-like growth factor IGF-1 that's activated by growth hormone and indirectly supports the formation of new proteins in muscle cells and bone cells. In other words, mitosis. So if you don't remember all of the details of mitosis and you don't remember protein synthesis, if you don't remember these things that I keep saying, do you remember? Do you remember? The same YouTube channel that you're picking up this lecture off of also houses my Bio 210 lectures. So if you don't have access to Bio 210 lectures, you might want to go back. If I'm talking about positive feedback and you're like, oh heck, I don't remember that, go find that in my Bio 210 lectures. All right, you can find it in your textbook, so you know what chapter to look for. So go to your textbook, look in the index. It's that fancy thing at the very end that tells you where that particular topic is covered, and then go find that chapter in my YouTube videos and find that particular section talking about that and listen to it. A little bit of work, but at least you'll get to hear the information again if you didn't pick it up first time around, or if you don't remember it real clear, or you just want a reminder, or you just love hearing me talk and you want to go listen to those. Some of the indirect actions associated with growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to target the liver and other organs to produce proteins called insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. IGFs stimulate cellular proliferation, or mitosis, and inhibit apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. IGFs also stimulate cells to increase their uptake of amino acids from the blood for protein synthesis. Another indirect action is cartilage cells and skeletal muscle cells are particularly sensitive to stimulation of IGFs. So I like to talk about abnormalities where I can in hormones, because those are really interesting. And one of them is hypersecretion of growth hormone. And this is typically caused by a pituitary tumor. So remember I said that the pituitary gland is sitting in that little perfect little spot called the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone in the skull. And so what can happen is if you get a tumor growing in that area, because the pituitary gland is sitting in this bony structure, if that tumor starts to grow, it actually pushes on the pituitary gland. And one of the things that it causes hypersecretion when that pushing happens, because it's all crowded in there, is hypersecretion of growth hormone. So in children, this is going to result in giantism. So you get really tall really, really fast, right? If this happens in adults, it can result in a condition called acromegaly. So in children, they get super tall super fast, and you notice something's wrong, and you go to the doctor, and they figure out that it's usually a benign tumor on the pituitary gland, and they remove that, and that stops that. You don't shrink back down, you stay really tall, but nonetheless, we have ways of monitoring that in our country. In an adult, because the epiphyseal plates have closed and you no longer have growth occurring in the long bones, they develop a condition called acromegaly, where the bones of the face and the hands and the feet, which can continue to elongate and get larger over your lifetime, you'll see those hands get bigger, their feet get bigger, their face elongates and gets long. And it's noticeable. It's not like the typical signs of aging. You know, when you get older, your feet get bigger. This is like suddenly your feet get bigger, like over the course of a couple of months. Again, usually the result of a pituitary tumor. Over on the right-hand side, you might not know who that is, but that is Andre the Giant. And Andre the Giant, unfortunately, he suffered from a abnormality, a hypersecretion of growth hormone. It had giantism as a child and went on to have acromegaly as an adult. He's standing next to a average-sized human, so you can see he was way over 7 feet tall. He was from France, and he was a famous wrestler, so you can look up who Andre the Giant was if you don't already know. He died in his 30s, I believe, or early 40s. He ended up having problems with his heart based, as a result of his acromegaly and giantism. The other end of this growth hormone issue is hyposecretion. So you end up with children that have a growth impairment called pituitary dwarfism. And so they are perfectly miniaturized adults, right? So they don't get much taller than that chair, so 3 feet or so. You don't see this a lot in the United States anymore because we take children to baby checks, and baby checks are measuring bone length and all this kind of stuff, and there's all these charts and all this sort of stuff. So if someone were suffering from a too low of a growth hormone release, we have medications for that. But you do see it still in some parts of the world where they don't monitor that. Dwarfism, we're going to cover dwarfism again in the end of the semester when we talk about genetics. There's more than 100 forms of dwarfism. The most common form is called achondroplasia, which is what you think of typically when you think of dwarfism, where they have a normal sized trunk but shortened arms and legs. And that is genetic, and we'll talk about the anomaly associated with that at the end of the semester. But pituitary dwarfism, they don't have shortened arms or legs. They're just miniaturized. So all of the characters used to see associated, Tiny Tim and Thumbelina and all of that used to see associated with circus sideshows. Those were all individuals who had hyposecretion of growth hormone or pituitary dwarfism. Moving on to thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. This regulates the secretion of thyroid hormones by the thyroid gland in your neck. So TSH is released in response to thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, from the hypothalamus. Elevated levels of thyroid hormones trigger a drop in the production of TRH and subsequently TSH. So again, negative feedback. So here's one that there's actually 3 hormones in the chain. So you have TRH released by the hypothalamus that targets the anterior pituitary to release TSH that causes the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone, which is going to target specific cells. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This stimulates the adrenal cortex, which are the little hats sitting on top of your kidneys, to secrete corticosteroid hormones such as cortisol. A variety of stressors can influence the release of this, and therefore ACTH and corticosteroid in general plays a role in your stress response. Our gonadotropins, including follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Puberty is initiated by gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, from the hypothalamus. Remember, the RH means hypothalamus. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete the gonadotropins, hormones that regulate the function of the gonads, follicle-stimulating and luteinizing. All right, the gonadotropins are going to include 2 hormones. Follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH. FSH is going to stimulate the production and maturation of sex cells or gametes. Follicle is a sex cell, so it stimulates the production maturation of eggs in and sperm in males. It also promotes follicular growth, the follicles that release estrogens in the female ovaries. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, is what triggers ovulation. So ovulation is the release of the egg from the ovary each month at day 14 in her cycle, as well as the production of estrogens and progesterone by the ovaries. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of testosterone by the male testes. Prolactin, or PRL, it promotes lactation or milk production in females. During pregnancy, it contributes to the development of the mammary glands, and after birth, it stimulates the mammary glands to produce breast milk. Its presence in males is poorly understood. We know we have it. They know they can test for it. You have it, but we don't know what it does. So just a review slide of posterior pituitary hormones, right? So ADH and oxytocin. Here they're using OT as the abbreviations. Like I said, in other books you'll see it as OX. Shows you some important information. What is the releasing hormone, if there is one? What is hormone? What is the target? What is the effect? That's what you need to know about every single one of these. And here's the big boy. This is what's happening with the anterior pituitary. All right. Again, releasing hormone in the first column coming from the hypothalamus. What's the name of the hormone? What's the target? And what are the effects? So that was just the pituitary hormones. Aren't you glad you're here today? Thyroid gland. This is your thyroid gland is found on top of your trachea and your neck, below your voice box or your larynx. There are two sides to it, a right and left lobe, and they're connected by a strip of tissue called the isthmus, which is just difficult to say. If we were to take the thyroid gland off and look on the back side of it, we would see that there are typically 4 patches of tissue, one in each quadrant, called the parathyroid glands. All right, those are on the posterior surface. The tissue of the thyroid gland is composed mostly of something called thyroid follicles, or like these hollow spheres. So thyroid hormone is released by the thyroid gland because of thyroid stimulating hormone. All right. And thyroid stimulating hormone is released by the anterior pituitary because of the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Thyroid hormone comes in 2 versions, T3 and T4. Both hormones share the same protein, thyroglobulin, but T3 has 3 iodines and T4 has 4 iodines. That's the difference between the two. T3 is more potent than T4, and many cells convert T4 to T3 by stripping off an iodine before use. What does thyroid hormone do? It does a bunch. We typically think of it as, oh, there's something wrong with my thyroid and it's causing me to gain weight, or there's something wrong with my thyroid and it's causing me to lose weight. We typically think about it that way, but it does a bunch of other stuff too. So it influences the basal metabolic rate, which is what I was talking about there, the amount of energy your body uses at rest. It initiates the transcription of genes involved in glucose oxidation, in other words, how we get ATP from glucose. It's required for protein synthesis and for fetal and childhood growth development and growth and development. So it does a bunch of stuff. It is critical for the normal development of the nervous system, both in utero and in early childhood, and contributes to support of neurological function in adults. It has a complex interrelationship with our reproductive hormones. Deficiencies can lead to libido, fertility, and other problems associated with reproductive function. It increases the body's sensitivity to catecholamines, including epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. So the thyroid gland is why you need iodine. And again, this is not a condition that you're going to see a lot of issues with here in the United States. We put iodine in salt, and we put salt in everything. So if you've ever wondered what the difference is when you go to buy salt, it'll have ionized salt and non-iodine salt. The difference is, do we have iodine put in it? So until they started doing this, people experienced what we see in the slide, which is a dietary deficiency of iodine, and that is necessary for the synthesis of T3 and T4. When that can't happen, you end up with a buildup of the thyroid hormone in the thyroid gland, and it produces what's called a goiter. And so essentially what iodine does is help in the release of those two forms of um, thyroid hormone, and so it can't get out. So thyroglobulin accumulates in the thyroid gland follicles, and then we see the thyroid gland get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we call that a goiter. So the treatment for that is to increase the amount of dietary iodine, but we don't want to do it too fast because then we can put the patient into another issue where they've got too much thyroid hormone and cause all kinds of problems there. All right, iodine deficiency in infants and during pregnancy can lead to impaired growth and development. It can also lead to decreased fertility and prenatal and infant death. Iodine deficiency is the primary cause of preventable intellectual disabilities worldwide. Neonatal hyperthyroidism, also known as cretinism, is characterized by cognitive deficits, short stature, and sometimes deafness or muteness in children and adults that are born to mothers who had an iodine deficient pregnancy. All right, let's talk about some disorders, other disorders associated with the thyroid. Hypothyroidism is low blood levels of thyroid hormones. This is characterized by a low metabolic rate, weight gain, cold extremities, constipation, reduced libido, menstrual irregularities, and reduced mental activity. Hyperthyroidism, on the other hand, is elevated blood levels of thyroid, which can lead to a condition called Graves' disease. This leads to an increase in the metabolic rate, excessive body heat and sweating, diarrhea, weight loss, tremors, and an increased heart rate. The person may also have eyes that bulge, and that condition is called exophthalmos, and they may also develop a goiter. So the person you see on the right is Marty Feldman, and Marty Feldman was classic for having Graves' disease. There were a few other people. Barbara and George Bush Sr. both had hyperthyroidism. There's a few people that have seen it. Usually the eyes are the big dead giveaway on that one. All right, the hormone calcitonin. So I want you to look at the word calcitonin. So calcium means that it has to do with the calci part has to do with calcium, and the N at the end, the IN, tells you that it puts calcium into storage. So that might help you a little bit remember that one. It's produced by the parafollicular or C cells in response to a rise in blood calcium. So blood calcium has to be monitored, just like we're going to see that sugar always has to be monitored, glucose always has to be monitored as well. We don't want too much, we don't want too little, and so it's always being monitored, right? So if we have too much blood calcium, calcitonin is released. What calcitonin does is inhibit the activity of the osteoclasts. Osteoclasts, as you'll remember from skeletal system, are the ones that break down bone, and when they break down bone, they release calcium into the blood. It increases the osteoblast activity. Osteoblasts were the ones that built bone, so they take calcium out of the blood. This could be used as um, a, a springboard for treating osteoporosis. But again, this involves the skeletal system. It decreases the calcium absorption at the intestines. And so you pass it through in solid waste, and it increases the calcium loss in the urine, and so that's going to involve our urinary system. The important things to remember is that calcitonin, and we're going to see its companion, PTH, are going to be working on three major systems: skeletal, digestive, and urinary. So these functions by themselves are not significant in maintaining calcium homeostasis. Why? Because too much calcium is rarely a problem. For every 1,200, 2,000, I think it is, 2,000 milligrams of calcium you ingest, you actually only absorb 800 milligrams of it across your digestive lining and are able to use it. So too much calcium is not a problem unless someone is abusing calcium drugs or there's some other disease state. So calcitonin rarely gets called into play, but we do need to know it's there. The other hormone we're going to talk about is called parathyroid hormone, or PTH, and it comes from our parathyroid glands. And so these are tiny round structures that are on the back side of the thyroid. So if you look at our picture, we're looking at the thyroid from behind. It's like we're looking at the back of somebody's head, and you can see the thyroid sticking out on either side, and you see those little blue circles. Those are the parathyroid glands. There's typically four, one in each quadrant. PTH, unlike calcitonin, is the major hormone involved in the regulation of blood calcium levels. And so what it's going to do is it's going to put calcium into the blood. Okay. If somebody has to have their thyroid gland removed, the parathyroid glands and the thyroid gland are separate. They have separate innervation. They have a separate blood supply, and they actually save those, as many of those as they can, and they embed them, believe it or not, in your sternocleidomastoid, that big old strip of muscle in your neck. They embed them in there so that they can continue to do their job. Otherwise, if somebody has their thyroid removed and they take away the parathyroid glands in that process as well, then they have to be on medication for the rest of their life. Now, if your thyroid is diseased in some way, or it's an accident that causes the removal of it, obviously there's nothing they can do about that. You have to go on medication, but they do try to salvage those parathyroid glands. So PTH regulates calcium through the following systems. It's basically the opposite of what I just talked about. It's going to stimulate the osteoclast, or the breaking down of bone, and therefore release calcium into the bloodstream, as well as inhibit the osteoblasts that have been taking it out of the bloodstream. So again, your skeletal system is involved. It causes increased reabsorption of calcium and magnesium in the kidney tubules from the urinary filtrate, so urinary system is involved. PTH is going to initiate the production of vitamin D3 in the kidneys, so that is your urinary system as well. And vitamin D3 stimulates an increased absorption of dietary calcium by your intestines, so your digestive system is involved. So again, three systems that are involved in the homeostasis of your calcium. It's going to be your skeletal system, which is what we all think of, because that's one of the main functions of the skeletal systems, was to store calcium, urinary, and digestive. So imbalances in PTH are where we always have concerns, not really any concerns about imbalances in calcitonin. So hyperparathyroidism is caused by overproduction of PTH. This is going to result in excessive calcium reabsorption from the bone, and can significantly decrease bone density, leading to spontaneous fractures and deformities. As blood calcium levels are going to rise, the cell membrane permeability to sodium is decreased, and the responsiveness of the nervous system is reduced. Hypoparathyroidism is an abnormally low blood calcium level caused by something wrong, a deficiency by that parathyroid itself. Low blood calcium increases membrane permeability to sodium, resulting in muscle twitching, cramping, spasms, and convulsions. Severe deficits can paralyze muscles, including those involved in breathing, and can be fatal. All right, moving along to the adrenal glands. So remember, the adrenal glands they are separate organs that are sitting on top of the kidneys. And they, like our pituitary gland that was made of some glandular tissue and some nervous tissue, they're the same kind of idea. So remember, the pituitary gland, anterior and posterior pituitaries, are derived from two different embryonic tissues, and they just happen to be housed together. The same kind of thing is happening with the adrenal glands. So the outer part of it's called the cortex. Cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. And it's made of glandular tissue, and the inner medullary area is made of nervous tissue. The cortex is divided into three zones: the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, I have a hard time saying that, and the reticularis. Each region is going to secrete its own set of hormones. One of the major functions of the adrenal gland is to respond to physical and physiological stress. Physical stresses can be things like an injury, walking outside in really cold and wet conditions without a coat on, getting overly heated, malnutrition. So those are physical things that happen to your body. Psychological stresses include the perception of physical threat. So you're scared. Maybe you have a fight with someone, or you have a bad day at school with your anatomy professor. Can't imagine that ever happening, right? So here we are looking at the adrenal gland over on the left-hand side. So again, it's sitting up over on top of the kidney. And it's showing you the cortex, which is the yellow area, and or I'm sorry, the pink area, not the yellow area, the pinkish area, and then the medulla, which is in the very middle of that. On the middle thing, it's showing you what that looks like underneath of a micrograph, which is not super easy to see, but the cells do look different. And then it shows you what's the important part is the tissue area, the glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. The hormones that it releases would be the mineralocorticoids. So minero tells you that they have something to do with mineral balance, and an example of that is aldosterone. The next area down is called the fasciculata. See, I could say it that time. These are the glucocorticoids and the corticoids, and they're going to regulate glucose metabolism. And so cortisol, cortisterone, and cortisone are all examples of hormones that are released by that second layer. The third area is called the reticularis. It's going to release androgens, which stimulate masculinization, and specifically, it's a type of testosterone. The medulla, which is way down at the very bottom, the inner part right there, that is going to release stress hormones that you're familiar with as your adrenal hormones, so epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal cortex is a component of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA. So here's how it works. The hypothalamus is going to release corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, which is going to target the anterior pituitary, and that's going to cause the release of adrenocorticotropic, or ACTH, from the anterior pituitary. ACTH is going to travel to and target the adrenal cortex. This is going to cause the secretion of steroid hormones, including cortisol, that are important for the regulation of long-term stress responses, blood pressure and blood volume, nutrient uptake, storage fluid and electrolyte balance, and inflammation. It's a whole bunch of stuff. So again, here's a picture of what the adrenal cortex looks like, the three structurally distinct regions. Each of these is going to produce a different group of hormones. I think it's a total of about 20 different hormones. We don't have to know all of them. There's just some that we'll pick out to know, but there's a lot of hormones released by the adrenal cortex. All right, let's talk specifically about the hormones related to the zona glomerulosa. So there's a group of hormones that come from this area. It's because they have an effect on the body's minerals. These hormones are essential in fluid and electrolyte balance. The most important one of those is aldosterone. It is important in regulating sodium and potassium ion concentrations in the extracellular fluid, so the fluid outside of the cells. It increases the excretion of potassium ion and the retention of sodium ion, which in turn increases blood volume and therefore blood pressure. Aldosterone is a key component of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system known as RAS in maintaining blood pressure. I am going to talk about RAS 4 times this semester. That's how incredibly important this is to understand. So we're going to learn the big picture idea in this chapter, and then we're going to have 3 more chapters where it's going to come up again. Doesn't matter what type of healthcare you're going in, this you have to understand. And so many, many years ago, I was talking to nurses and asking them, what are the 3 big things you hope that your students know when they get to you after they've been in anatomy and physiology? And of course, they said things like blood flow through the heart and things like that. But this one kept coming up. If they understood this, or at least had a big picture idea of RAS, it would help so much. So I'm going to hit this really hard. And when you walk away from here, if you don't know anything else about anatomy and physiology 2, you're going to understand about RAS. At least I hope. All right. Specialized cells in the kidneys are going to secrete the enzyme renin in response to low blood volume or low blood pressure. Okay. So it doesn't really matter why you have that low blood pressure or low blood volume at that particular time. We'll talk about that later. All we know is that the kidneys are monitoring that. There's special cells that we're going to learn about when we get to urinary that are responsible for making sure that That's monitored all the time. Renin is then going to catalyze the conversion of a blood protein called angiotensinogen. If you did not learn in 210 that the suffix ogen at the end of a word tells you that it's an enzyme, I'm reminding you now. Angiotensinogen is produced by the liver, and it is converted to the hormone angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is then converted into angiotensin 2 by ACE, or angiotensin converting enzyme, in the lungs. So we'll talk about this when we get to respiratory. You might have heard of ACE inhibitors. They are a type of high blood pressure medication. They typically end in the suffix pril, like lisinopril, right? And so what they do is they are an inhibitor of this converting enzyme. What's happening is your angiotensin converting enzyme is working too well, and so they inhibit that. So now we're angiotensin 2. We have three major functions. We're going to initiate vasoconstriction of the arterioles, which increases the resistance to blood flow. We're going to signal the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone, which is going to stimulate the kidney tubules to reabsorb sodium ion and water, which is going to increase the blood volume. And then we're going to induce ADH production by the pituitary gland to retain water. So all those things are the things that angiotensin 2 is going to be. Individuals, as I mentioned, with hypertension use drugs that block the production of angiotensin 2 by inhibiting the ACE activities. So here is a picture of that. So we're looking over on the far left-hand side. There's Mr. Happy Kidney, Sydney the kidney. Sydney's going to detect low blood pressure, going to cause the release of renin. That's going to be released from the kidneys into the blood. That's going to cause the conversion of angiotensinogen that came from the liver into angiotensin 1. And then ACE is going to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is going to have widespread effects in the body, all of which are going to increase the blood pressure. Vasoconstriction of the arterioles, increase the amount of antidiuretic hormone, it's going to contact or come in stimulate the adrenal cortex, which is going to cause the production of aldosterone, which is going to cause you to reabsorb sodium and water. And all of those different things going on at the same time are going to increase the blood pressure. There's some other things as well, like it's going to activate angiotensin 2 activates the thirst center to make you drink more, because that'll increase your blood volume as well. There's some other things that we'll be talking about along the way as well, but I want you to get the big picture idea right now. What about the fasciculata? So this is going to produce the glucocorticoids. Gluco means glucose, because of their role in glucose metabolism and response to long-term stresses under the influence of ACTH. The most important of these is cortisol. It is converted by the liver to cortisone. In conditions of long-term stress, cortisol promotes the breaking down of polymers of carbohydrate, protein, and triglyceride into monomers. Cortisol also downregulates the immune system, which inhibits the inflammatory response. So we're talking about long-term stressors, not something that you just had a bad day type thing. This is long-term things. So when you have the loss of a loved one, or the loss of your job, or the loss of your housing, it can go on and on and on. Things that are long-term stressors. That's where this hormone comes in. The reticularis, the third layer. This produces a class of steroid hormones called androgens. During puberty and most of adulthood, the androgens are produced in the gonads. The androgens produced in the reticularis are supplemental to the gonadal androgens. So we're going to learn that estrogen and testosterone and all that sort of stuff, they're all being produced primarily by ovaries and testes. However, you have a small amount being produced in the zona reticularis. These are produced in response to ACTH from the anterior pituitary and are converted in the tissues to testosterone or estrogens. There are more than one type of estrogen, so that is a plural word. In adult women, they may contribute to the sex drive, but their function in adult men is not well understood. The zona reticularis is the main source of estrogen in postmenopausal women. What are some disorders? Hypersecretion of cortisol leads to a condition called Cushing's disease. This is a disorder that's characterized by high blood glucose levels and accumulation of lipid deposits on the face and neck. So this is another form of diabetes that can happen. So there's diabetes associated with Cushing's disease. This can be the result of pituitary tumor that secretes cortisol or ACTH in abnormally high amounts. So here are some of the symptoms of Cushing's disease. The big one that most people see is what's called a buffalo hump. It's like fat right at your cervical region, right below your cervical region at the shoulders, right at the top of your shoulders. But there's some other symptoms as well, including muscle wasting, osteoporosis, all kinds of things like that that you can see from here. So other symptoms of Cushing's include the development of a moon face. So your face gets very round, a buffalo hump on the back of the neck that I just mentioned, rapid weight gain and hair loss. Chronically elevated glucocorticoids compromise the immune system. They have leading to a resistance to infection and memory, and can result in rapid weight gain and hair loss. So this is when the hormone itself is out of control. These are also what can happen when you use um, uh, cortisone long term, prednisone specifically. So when you have to take prednisone long term, you see a lot of these, and they call that Cushing syndrome. So Cushing disease is when your own hormones are kind of out of whack. Cushing's syndrome is when you have it's resulting from long-term use of steroidal hormones like prednisone. So if you've ever taken prednisone, and it's a great drug for short-term problems like I get poison ivy really, really bad, and I cannot get it back under control. Once it starts, I just cannot get it under control, and I usually have to end up going on a Z-Pack of prednisone. So it's a step down. So you have to take a whole bunch of pills the first day, and then you take less the second day, and less the third day, and you get down to the point where you're taking none, and you just step it right down. That's to help prevent Cushing's syndrome. Interestingly, Cushing's is not real uncommon in dogs. And so you may find out when you have a dog that's a little bit older, they test them for Cushing's. It's one of the more common diseases that we share. Okay, on the other end of the scale, hyposecretion of our corticosteroids can result in a condition called Addison's disease. This is a relatively rare disorder, causes a low blood glucose levels and low blood sodium levels. Some other symptoms are general weakness, abdominal pain, weight loss, nausea, vomiting, sweating, and craving for salty food. And one that I don't have listed on here that I want you to know about is bronzing of the skin. So it makes it look like you have a really great tan, but you're kind of metallic-y shiny, right? So that is a symptom of Addison's disease that you don't see with any other condition. Interestingly enough, John F. Kennedy had Addison's disease. So John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. He was actually president when I was born, which gives you kind of an idea just how old I really am. But nonetheless, he had Addison's disease. And when you see pictures of him, he always looks like he's really, really tan. But he also was horribly thin. He could not keep weight on, and he had a lot of other health issues related to his Addison's disease. So if he had not been assassinated, he most likely would have died from complications of Addison's in the not too distant future from the time that he was actually assassinated. Interesting story about his diseases. The medulla, which is the very inside part of the adrenal gland, is the neuroendocrine tissue. It is an extension of the autonomic nervous system. The adrenal medulla releases its hormones in response to acute short-term stress. So all the stuff we were talking about with the cortex and stress, that was all long-term stress. These are short-term stressors. These are, oh my gosh, I'm sitting at the light and I look up and I realize that the guy sitting that's coming up behind me doesn't realize that the light is red and he's barreling towards the back end of my car, and your heart starts pounding and all that sort of stuff. That's short-term stressors. And so what we produce is epinephrine, also called adrenaline, and norepinephrine or noradrenaline. right? The epinephrine is the most powerful and abundant of these two hormones, and both are released into systemic circulation where they exert their effect on distant cells. And both are fast acting. This is probably the only example of fast acting hormones in all of the hormones we talk about. The effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine, they signal the liver and skeletal muscles to convert glycogen, the storage form of glucose, into glucose, dump it into the blood so you have extra blood glucose so you can fight or flee. Increased heart rate, pulse, blood pressure, all preparing your body for a perceived threat. Dilates the airways so you can get more air in, therefore more oxygen in. Promotes vasodilation of your vessels and triggers vasoconstriction in the blood vessels that serve less essential organs like your digestive system, right? Your digestive system is not especially important when you're in an emergency, right? And so think about all of the things that you would need to have happen if you needed to flee suddenly or you needed to stand and fight. That's what the epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to do for you. Both hormones have many of the same effects, but epinephrine is a stimulator of metabolic activities, so things like bronchial dilation and blood flow to the skeletal muscles and the heart. Norepinephrine, on the other hand, is a greater influence on peripheral vasoconstriction and blood pressure and things like that. Responses to the stressors are brief, and unlike what you see in the adrenocortical hormones, um, panic attacks are often associated with uncontrolled release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So you might know what it feels like to have a panic attack, and you know how that feels, but you know that it eases off pretty quickly usually, and so that shows you the how quickly those dissipate from your system. So just looking at the hormones of the adrenal glands. So our aldosterone is a steroid and it increases our blood sodium levels. Our cortisol, cortisone, and cortisterone are steroids that increase the glucose levels, and epinephrine and norepinephrine are amine classifications. So they are that protein amino acid classification, and they stimulate the fight or flight response. Moving on to the pineal gland. This is located in your brain. You should have seen this last semester in your studies of the nervous system. It's inferior and posterior to the thalamus. It produces and secretes melatonin, which is a derivative of serotonin. Melatonin production is inhibited by light and promoted by darkness. This is the hormone that helps you fall asleep at night. Right. So when the lights get dim and it gets darker and you start to feel drowsy and tired, it's because your brain is being bathed in melatonin. As soon as the lights come on or that first light comes through your eye in the morning, through your thin eyelid in the morning, that melatonin production stops or shuts down and you wake up. So melatonin influences the body's circadian rhythm, the sleep cycle I was just talking about. It prevents the release of gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary, which prevents early puberty. So they've done some really interesting studies on melatonin, and what they have found is that individuals that are in the equatorial regions of the world, so women in equatorial regions in particular is where they've noticed this, start their menstrual cycle 2 to 3 years earlier than women who live um, in areas that are higher in latitude, like like Norway, like that, where they don't have nearly as much sun. So kind of an interesting thing. But the sleep cycle portion is what most people know melatonin for. The pancreas is a long, slender organ located behind the stomach. It's sort of an unglamorous, sort of lumpy looking, kind of looks like a wad of chewed gum organ. It serves as both an exocrine and an endocrine. The pancreatic islets are the portion we're interested in for the endocrine system. They secrete glucagon and insulin, which are going to be the focus of our conversation here, but also somatostatin and pancreatic polypeptide, which we're not going to talk about. But we are going to talk about glucagon. So it's produced by the alpha cells to increase glucose blood levels. So just like we saw with calcitonin and PTH, that we're monitoring the amount of glucose in this case in our blood, these two hormones are going to keep that in balance for us all the time. And unlike what we saw with calcitonin and PTH, who the PTH was really the major effector on all of that. In this case, these two hormones work together quite a bit. All right, so alpha cells are what produces. The alpha cells were discovered first, so glucagon was actually discovered before insulin. How do they increase glucose levels? They stimulate the liver, which is where we store our excess glucose, or one of the places we store our excess glucose, to convert the storage form glycogen back into glucose, and that is known as glycogenolysis. Stimulates the liver to take up amino acids and convert them into glucose. This is known as gluconeogenesis, making new glucose out of something that wasn't glucose to start with. And it stimulates lipolysis, which is the breakdown of stored triglycerides into free fatty acids and glycerol. Some of the free glycerol are going to travel to the liver, which is then converted into glucose, and that is also a form of gluconeogenesis. About insulin for a few minutes. So insulin is secreted by the beta cells in your pancreas, and it is going to lower blood glucose levels, and it does that by facilitating the uptake of glucose by your body cells, meaning skeletal muscle cells and adipose cells. Those are the primary targets. So any excess calories that come into your body, any excess calories, regardless of whether they are from carbohydrate, fat, or from protein, any excess calories are stored primarily as fat. It also stimulates glycolysis, which is the metabolism of glucose for the generation of ATP. It stimulates the liver to convert glucose into glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, and it inhibits enzymes that are involved in glycogenolysis and glyconeogenesis. Insulin promotes triglyceride and protein synthesis. So insulin puts glucose into storage, just like calcitonin puts calcium into storage. So that's how that whole thing works there. These two are always working together, insulin and glucagon, putting glucose into storage, taking glucose out of storage. And therefore, we can maintain a blood glucose of about 100 all of the time. So that's kind of the magic number that they're shooting for when they test your blood sugar is around 100. So diabetes mellitus, DM, this is a dysfunction of insulin production and secretion, as well as the target cell's responsiveness to insulin. It can lead to a condition called diabetes mellitus. There are two forms of diabetes. There's type 1 diabetes, which was formerly called juvenile diabetes or insulin-dependent diabetes. And type 2 diabetes, which was formerly called adult onset diabetes or non-insulin dependent diabetes. All right, two main forms. Type 1 is an autoimmune disease affecting the beta cells of the pancreas. The beta cells do not produce insulin. This form of diabetes accounts for less than 5% of all diabetes cases. It's typically diagnosed in young people, and they typically have to use some form of insulin. Type 2 diabetes accounts for the other approximate 95% of all cases. It is acquired form of diabetes, and lifestyle factors, including poor diet, inactivity, and the presence of pre-diabetes, greatly increase a person's risk. A majority of the people that have type 2 diabetes are overweight. In type 2 diabetes, the cells become resistant to the effects of insulin. So the first thing they try to get you to do, of course, is to lose some weight. If you can lose some weight and become more active, because sometimes people aren't necessarily horribly overweight, but they're not active enough. And so they get them a little more active, and they get them to lose a little bit of weight and change their diet a little bit. And sometimes you can stave off the problem of type 2 diabetes. One of the funny stories I always tell about diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is one of the side effects of type 2 diabetes is in males it causes erectile dysfunction. So I always say, if you sat someone down who was pre-diabetic, a man, and explained to him that if he didn't get this under control, he would lose his ability to engage in intercourse, I have a feeling he might clean up his diet real quick. Gonadal and placental hormones. The ovaries have two major hormones that they produce: estrogen, which plays an important role in the development of the female reproductive system, regulates the menstrual cycle. It helps to develop the female's secondary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics are the things that you think of that when you think of what a female looks like: a curvier body, the development of breasts, the softer voice, softer hair, all those kinds of things like that. Those are what they consider secondary sex characteristics. And estrogen is also involved in the maintenance of a pregnancy. Progesterone is the other hormone that is produced by your ovaries, and it contributes to the regulation of the menstrual cycle, and it is important in preparing the body for pregnancy as well as maintaining a pregnancy. So I always say progesterone begins with the letter P and pregnancy begins with the letter P. And so progesterone maintains a pregnancy. The male testes produce testosterone. Testosterone is important in the development of the male reproductive system. It's also important in the maturation of sperm cells and the development of male secondary sex characteristics, like the musculature and the development of a beard and the coarser hair and all of those kinds of things that we think of when we think of males. In addition, the testes produce inhibin, which inhibits the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Follicle-stimulating hormone is what stimulates spermatogenesis that we'll be talking about later in the semester. The placenta is considered a temporary endocrine organ because you don't always have one, and only 50% of us ever have one, right? That's females. And it produces and secretes estrogens and progesterone. It also produces human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. Note how that is written. It's little h, big CG, different from what we've done for other abbreviations. It promotes progesterone synthesis and reduces the mother's immune function to protect the fetus from immune rejection. So that might be something you've never really thought about, but when you produce, when fertilization happens, you produce an individual that is genetically half not you. And so the mom's immune system can actually attack that. But what keeps that from happening is HCG. We always think about HCG because that's what they test for in pregnancy tests. Human placental lactogen, or HPL. Again, note the way that that is abbreviated. It plays a role in preparing the breasts for lactation. And finally, it produces relaxin, which is thought to help soften and widen the pubic symphysis in preparation for childbirth. So the pubic symphysis was the piece of fibrocartilage that was holding the two hip bones together in the front. And so that has to soften and stretch during childbirth. The thymus, an organ of the immune system that is larger and more active during infancy, basically shrivels down to nothing as we age. So when it atrophies as we get older. Its endocrine function is the production of a group of hormones called thymosins that contribute to the development and the differentiation of the T lymphocytes, or immune cells, that we'll be talking about in a few chapters. There's a few organs that we have that have secondary endocrine function. We don't keep them in the list of organs that are truly considered part of the endocrine system. They just have some tissues or some cells that have some endocrine function. The heart is one of them. It secretes atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, in response to high blood pressure. So we have the whole aldosterone, angiotensin, renin thing going on that helps to bring blood pressure up. But this one hormone helps to bring blood pressure down. It reduces sodium reabsorption from the kidneys, which decreases the amount of water that's saved and ultimately reduces the blood volume and therefore the blood pressure because you urinate it off. ANP aids in decreasing blood pressure, blood volume, and blood sodium levels. The kidneys, they produce renin in response to low blood flow to the kidneys, which triggers the the already famous RAS system, and that's going to increase blood flow and therefore blood pressure. They also produce vitamin D3 in response to secretion of parathyroid hormone, and that helps to regulate blood calcium levels. And one we haven't talked about is erythropoietin, EPO, is produced by the kidneys in response to low oxygen levels. So the kidneys are monitoring that oxygen level of the blood. EPO stimulates the production of more red blood cells. It actually increases the maturation process more than stimulates them. And so we have more available red blood cells for oxygen delivery. EPO has a synthetic version called Procrit that do sometimes give patients that are on chemotherapy if they're having problems with anemia and low blood oxygen, those sorts of things. EPO synthetic and the natural form are both illegal in Olympic athletes because they give you more red blood cells, and more red blood cells mean you have more oxygen, and when you have more oxygen, you can leap higher and go over giant buildings and all kinds of crazy stuff. There it is again. Told you I was going to bring it up again, but here it is again. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. I just want this to stay in your memory. So I'm just going to keep bringing it back up, and every time you look at it, it's going to be a slightly different picture that might speak to you. So again, always starts at the kidney. Got low blood pressure for some reason. The kidney's going to release renin. The renin's going to act on the angiotensinogen, which came from the liver, and convert that enzyme into angiotensin 1. ACE from the lungs is going to convert it into angiotensin 2, and then angiotensin 2 is going to go out and it's going to do things like vasoconstriction in the systemic circulatory system, salt and water retention at the kidney, aldosterone release at the adrenal gland, and sympathetic activity in the brain, including increased thirst. And finally, last but not least, is adipose tissue. Adipose tissue produces a hormone called leptin. There's a lot of research in this area right now. Bariatrics is a big thing. Leptin is a big thing. So you may see this out in the news. This is a hormone that's involved in lipid metabolism and storage, and it controls the appetite. So that's a lot, huh? So here's what I can say about hormones. There are a lot of them, and it can be confusing. So to unconfuse you a little bit, this is what I did 40 years ago when I took this course. Okay. I made a chart. Now, you guys have Excel spreadsheets and all kinds of fancy new ways to do things, but I had to actually write this out. I made a chart. And on that chart, I put the name of the hormone in one column, and then I put the name of the legal abbreviation in the next column, and then I put the hormone of the organ that released it. So I organized it by releasing organ. So I put all of the hormones released by the anterior pituitary first, or the hypothalamus first, and then all of the hormones released by the anterior pituitary, and then the posterior pituitary, then the thyroid. It just kind of went down the body, right? The next column, I had what its target was. Where does it go once it's released from that organ? And then I had a column for the effect. What does it do? And then finally, my last column was for stuff like diseases that were interesting or important that were brought up, or things that I want to remember, like Addison's disease causes bronzing of the skin, things like that I would want to remember about that particular hormone or a problem with that hormone. I'm going to post an example of that for you. Just with the first couple of ones so that you can make that. I highly recommend you make that chart. You learn while you're making it. And the other part to that is that you're going to actually add to that, because there's some hormones that I have not talked about yet, believe it or not. Truly, they should call the second semester of anatomy and physiology hormones, because it's going to come up in almost every system that we're talking about. So start making that chart, and that will help you, and you can just keep adding to that. Just keep it on your computer, and then you can just keep adding to it. I color coded mine. So I put all of my hypothalamic hormones. I just color coded that whole block, one color, and then I went down to my anterior pituitary and I made them a different color. I just filled in the whole thing with that particular color. That might help you a little bit too. All right, so after you study all of this, you have a quiz to take. I'm going to talk about blood next. Blood is not nearly so long, so be glad for that. And I'll see you then. Bye.